So we're going to be hopping around in time. And as I thought about how to put this talk together, I could organize it chronologically or by the history of each mill. And I decided to keep all of our brains from exploding, and we'd look at the history of each mill rather than trying to go chronologically through time and hop from mill to mill to mill. To help with that task, because I was going a little crazy from it, I'm titling each one of the mills with the names of either their first owners or what it's best known by. One of the things that you'll see in the talk, there's a lot of people who are named after each other. So if I start using people's middle names, that usually means there might be 13 Jeremiah Vales in a row. So if I say Jeremiah Vale, M Vale or whatever, that's why. So let's get started. Because I'm a historian, I like to torture people with a little history ahead of time. So we're going to start off with a little background. The town of Southold was inhabited for about 12,000 years by the Algonquin people before the Europeans arrived. The first Europeans came to the area in 1639, and they settled in an area called Hashimomic. The next wave of Europeans landed in 1640, and they founded the community of Southold. The town up to just about the Revolution stretched from Wading Rivers to Fisher's Island. And it's a fairly long thing. So I'm going to cover the mills in what is now the Riverhead area because that was part of Southold up to the Revolution. And I'll ignore the mills that came in the Riverhead area after that, sorta. So the North Fork is a peninsula that's blessed by the weather. The water moderates the temperatures. Generally, we have a breeze that's blowing. And we are, of course, surrounded by water. The Algonquins believed that the area was heaven on earth, and a lot of the current residents agree with that assessment. The earliest mill in the town was built sometime before 1654 by Thomas Benedict, who gave his name to the narrow waterway that has been known ever since as Tom's Creek that we see circled here. The first mention of the mill was in Thomas Cooper's land record, which used the mill near an area known as Oldfield as a landmark. It was located on the entrance of what is now Hashimomic Pond to Peconic Bay. And it would seem to be ideally suited, except there were no roads in that area until much later. Until the late 1600s, early 1700s, the main road in Southold, because of marshy land, stopped at Boisseau, and it turned and ran north around the other end of the pond and then went out east from there. In this later map, Benedict's mill was somewhere right about there, probably at the end of a fairly rough trail. And that all of a sudden went very quiet. Okay. By 1659, Thomas Benedict moved out of the Hashimomic area into Huntington. And before he sold the mill at Tom's Creek, he sold it over to John Payne. And this image is the Hashimomic Pond from the bridge that spans Tom's Creek, and the mill was probably on the left side of the picture by the trees. So to me, a tidal mill is any type of mill that uses water power. Sorry, it's my uneducated definition. And I wasn't sure how your group decided to define tidal mills, so I decided to include this mill that we have here. In 1659, John Tucker and Joseph Horton petitioned the town to build a sawmill, asking for 21 years exclusive rights. The two men were next-door neighbors in Southold, and John Tucker was the town's first blacksmith, and Joseph was the eldest son of Barnabas Horton, one of our more famous residents. The interior shot is not the mill, just so you know. The description of the petition for the mill states that it was near the head of a river, but within the town bounds, which for an area that has as many inlets and waterways as the Southold, it's virtually impossible to identify exactly where the sawmill might have been located. However, the mill was built in what is now Riverhead, and it's a long way off from where both men originally lived, which is where it says Southold there. But this is the only river we have in the area, and the river was the dividing line between Southold and Southampton. The men were given 3 years to set up the sawmill. In late 1661, early 1662, John Tucker came back to town and asked to enlarge the grant area to include 10 acres of land around the mill, which today would be most of downtown Riverhead. And here we have a later picture of it, and there's Riverhead. Okay, so there's Riverhead. You see most of Riverhead along the top of the screen. And in 1663, Tucker moves out of Southold and on to Brookhaven, leaving the Horton family the sole owners of the mill and the land. Later in time, the sawmill was taken apart and moved farther west to Peconic Avenue to become part of another Tidal mill called the Little Red Mill, which I had mixed up its clicking there. So the mill was being run as a fulling mill and later as a grist mill, grinding not only grain and for flour, but also corn for samp and Indian meal. In the late 19th century, Sylvester Woodhull acquired the mill with a large lot of land around the water, and he created a series of earthen dams to raise cranberries and raised the mill up, installed a taller foundation, and filled the canal that powered the wheel and made the building into a cranberry storage facility. In 1938, Frank Woodhull demolished the mill to run it as the building as an auto parts store. However, the land around the west side of the mill became a park, and let's go back to where that was. So you can see where there's all the different, where it says Granabelle Park, you can see the different ponds that they installed in order to raise cranberries. Our next mill is a little bit of a mystery. In 1690, John Griffin established a grist mill on the river, and where on the river, how long it lasted, we don't know. In fact, the only thing we know about it is the fact that Griffin asked to put in a mill in 1690. The next mill to be set up on the Peconic River was a fulling mill owned by John Wick. This mill may have been on the south side of the river, which would technically make it in Southampton, but he was fulling cloth for Southold as well as Southampton. And Wick got permission from Southampton to set up the mill, and they gave him a year and a half for construction. Apparently, he did not get the business up and running because in 1695, John Parker was given the rights to the same business on the river. Parker jump-started his construction process by obtaining a section of the Westhampton Presbyterian Church and moving it down to the river. The fulling mill passed down to Parker's son-in-law, William Albertson, and it passed down to the Albertson family until 1828. The original Parker Mill is part of a jumble of buildings that we see here, probably the building closest to us, but I can't actually confirm that that is it. In 1667, Captain Nathaniel Sylvester, who later on went on to found a manor in Shelter Island, petitioned the town to build a mill dam and acquire a parcel of upland containing 2 acres adjoining a grist mill and dam for his own use. The town granted the request, but Sylvester had to prioritize town residents' jobs before strangers, and the land was to be given back to the town if he didn't want it. The mill was to be sited somewhere along Tom's Creek, possibly opposite the Benedict Payne Mill. In 1671, land record of John Tuttle describes a meadow that he purchased back from Richard Brown, and it described it as being near a watermill that was in Oyster Ponds. This is the only mention of a watermill in Oyster Ponds. However, if you were going to put a watermill in Orient, there are 2 or 3 places that come to mind as a possibility for the site. One is Plum Gut, which has very strong tides when all of Long Island Sound rushes in and out of the area into the ocean. Or Orient Creek, which is not there. Orient Creek, which is, we see on the corner on the side here, that little marshy area on the left. It's an outlet for the oyster ponds. And the third possibility is an area which we call Dam Pond, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So sometime between 1660 and 1795, the mill that was at Tom's Creek had disappeared. And in 1795, William Albertson III petitioned the town to build a mill and bridge at Tom's Creek. The Albertson family was originally from the Netherlands, and William Albertson I settled in Oyster Bay. His son, William Albertson II, moved to the south shore of Peconic River, which is today Southampton section of Riverhead, and he married Mary Parker, who inherited the mill along with the Peconic River from her father, John Parker, who we just talked about. It's not clear if it was William II or his son, William III, who established the home and business in the town of Southold by 1743. However, William Albertson first appears in the Southold Town records in 1743 when his property was used as a landmark when a road was laid out. Albertson Mill, which is the first mill that we have more than a brief glimpse of its existence. Albertson built his mill on the east side of Tom's Creek, and had a house just down the street that we can see from this 1857 map. The mill was described as both a grist mill and a carding mill, and he ran the mill with enslaved African laborers. One of the reasons his workforce stuck in the minds of the community was because of Kedar, who had 3 children with his first wife and another 14 with his second wife. In 1855, the Albertson Mill was known as the Benedict and Hallett Mill at Tom's Creek. William Albertson died in 1764, and we know that his 3 sons squabbled over the division of their father's estate, causing the courts to assign arbitrators who dictated that everything in the estate be sold and the proceeds divided among the sons. It's likely that the mill, along with the enslaved people, were all sold at that time. But there's no information I have been able to find on who owned or ran the Albertson Mill in the 90-some-odd years between Albertson and Benedict and Hallett. This is the only known picture of the mill that I have been able to find. And you can see it's not in a great shape. In 1878, the mill at Tom's Creek, now 80-plus years, continues on as Benedict and Hallett, and it's sold to David F. Conklin and Company. Conklin, who was in his mid-30s, had been a farmer and either had the mill as a side job or he soon gave it up because in the 1880 census, he lists his occupation as a seaman. In 1797, New York State requested that the town supervisors produce a map of their townships. The map shows not only churches, but also schools and mills. Thomas More's map of Southold shows 11 windmills and 1 tidal mill. The map, which was spared from the 1911 archives fire, is a rare and valuable glimpse of the town, and it shows many more windmills than tidal mills, which is surprising for an area that's so surrounded by water. But we have no records on the majority of the mills that are actually shown on this map. In 1800, Elizabeth Bailey petitioned the town for permission to carry out the plans of her late husband, James. James had wanted to build a tidal mill on the outlet of Dam Pond in what was between today East Marion and Orient. There existed a bridge over the outlet of the pond to the bay, but no mill. If you recall a couple of slides back in this, this is the other possible location for the Oyster Ponds Mill. However, at the time of Elizabeth Bailey's petition, there's no mentioning that she's taking over an existing mill, only that she was seeking permission to build one. This is the mill that Elizabeth Bailey built, and as far as I know, she probably hired somebody and had the mill run for at least 20 or 30 years. We know that James Miller was the miller at Dam Pond in the late 1840s, early 1850s. He was followed by a Mr. Clark, who was originally a wheelwright by trade, but people on the east end of Long Island often had 2 or 3 different professions that they carried on to make ends meet. In 1853, Henry Horton decided that he didn't like commercial fishing. It was hard and tiring work. So he bought the mill, which was on the east side of the creek, and then he got another 2 acres of land on the west side. Horton eventually sold the property to Usher Benjamin, who ran it for a little while, and then he let it fall into decay. The stones were still partially visible in 1946, but they are gone today, probably buried in the sand around or under the roadway at this point, under the creek. The mill had a sign up by the bridge that said, "You are forbidden to drive across the bridge faster than a walk." And after someone who could actually spell let the author of the sign know their error, they kept it up as a curiosity. But it does tell you that there was an accent that was on the east end of Long Island that we probably didn't have across the rest of the island, because that's probably exactly how they said the word R, as the air. In 1835, town records report there are 7 grist mills that manufacture raw materials, but the records do not list which ones are tidal versus windmills. In 1821, most of Cox Neck was owned and occupied by the sons of Richard Cox. Richard was a farmer and a drover, and he frequently passed through Mattituck buying cattle. The region attracted him, and he bought a mill site and then built the mill in the same year. Of the 8 sons who survived him, 4 of them settled in Mattituck. And you can see from that dark section right in the middle of Mattituck, it's a considerable length in there. In 1822, the town records state that Cox and Associates be and are forever released and exonerated from all liability of the town in erecting and continuance of a mill and dam near the mouth of Mattituck Creek. And there is approximately where the mill stands. 1841, the Cox family sold shares in the mill to several different parties. James Worth bought a half interest in 1825, and Barnabas B. Horton a quarter interest in 1833. And others who were various times part owners were Walter and Edward Terry, Martin L. Robinson, and George W. Cooper. And you can actually see the mill in the distance at the end of the roadway there. The mill at Mattituck also had a long bridge that connected it to the opposite shore of Mattituck Inlet. A newspaper recounted the story that the recent sale of the old mill in Mattituck brings to mind an accident that occurred many years ago, which we doubt not the venerable miller will readily recall. In March 1852, the late S.W. Luce, then a resident of Northville, with his wife and infant daughter, were driving across the mill dam when the horse, a spirited animal, took fright at the water wheel then in motion and backed off the bridge. Mr. Terry, observing the animal's fright, seized the first thing at hand and ran to help them. But before he could get there, they were all in the water. With the clam rake, which he had in his hand, Mr. Terry caught one wheel and probably prevented the wagon from overturning. The horse broke loose and swam to shore, but Mr. Luce, the wife, and the baby were helped out and taken to the home of Mr. Luther Robinson. So you can see it's a long bridge, and it does get fairly deep. It's not until 1857 that the town ordered the supervisor of highways to build and lay out a road from Cox Lane to the mill itself. Before then, it was just a track that you could go down. By 1899, Uncle Josh W. Terry was the miller, and his little farm adjoined the mill. He also hired out rowboats and crab nets to visitors. Terry was born in 1821 in Brookhaven, and his family moved to Mattituck when he was 15, when his father sailed on a whaler with Smith Baldwin of Shelter Island. Josh had bought a half interest in the old mill from Barnabas Wines, who was the miller. But after Wines quit, Terry ran the mill for another 54 years. He claimed to the Brooklyn Times that the mill was constructed by Coles Wick, who built the structure for Richard Cox. In 1899, the pit wheel broke, and the owners decided not to fix it, probably realizing the mechanism had been outpaced the water-driven mills. So a short time later, in 1905, Joshua W. Terry passed away. A year after Josh Terry dies, the Mattituck Mill changes hands again, and it's sold at public auction for the purchase price of $300. Boy, if I had $300, right? It's sold to a German fellow by the name of Otto Magdefroy, and in 1906 he had a bar put in. And the County Review newspaper claims that the bar now prevents visitors and wayfarers from dying of thirst. At the same time, it puts up a lunch. The beams of the building begin to be graffitied by the customers, and it's claimed that the oldest name dates from 1840. It's estimated by 1920 that there are at least 5,000 names inscribed in the building. A brick chimney was installed on the west side bearing the inscription Old Mill 1821, and sometime later a porch was added. Also in 1906, a bridge which connected the two sides of the inlet was washed away in a storm during a high tide. So a second-hand metal turntable bridge was purchased and installed. Otto Magdefroy eventually sells to Joseph H. Richard, who spends the early part of 1921 negotiating with the town, asking for land and water grants in return for building a public dock. And you can see he did get part of it because there we have the dock down towards the bottom. The mill continued to serve as an entertainment center and was leased by Richard to various people. A dancing pavilion was built on the north side of the mill, which increased its usage. And in 1933, Richard decides that he has had enough, and he exchanged the property at the old mill in Mattituck with the town of Southold. In 1955, the turntable bridge that connected the two sides of the inlet of the mill was demolished, and the local newspaper in the Suffolk Times in 1972 ran the article that under the management of Fran and Dick Holmes since 1958, the Old Mill Restaurant is a popular tourist attraction. An old gear wheel from the original wheel is on display in the tap room of the old restaurant. Also, that the inclusion of the Mattituck Old Mill in the Long Island Inventory of Historic Engineering and Industrial Sites published recently by the Department of Interior, states that only 4 existing tide mills are classified as relatively rare engineering structures, according to the author John Gable of Briarcliff College. So the mill at Peconic, which is the last of my mills, is known as either the Peconic Tidal Mill or the Goldsmith Inlet Mill, depending upon who you're talking to. It was started as a business perspective, an agreement that the subscribers could invest in that was drawn up by a local lawyer, J.H. Goldsmith, in December of 1838. He stated that he had several millwrights look at the area, and they agreed that there was sufficient power there to run the tidal mill. Each share would be for sale for $10 each, and each shareholder would get a vote. According to an essay written on the mills in the area in 1954, there were 80 subscribers who bought up all the shares. Raising the $2,130 for construction in 1839, the construction started. And I have no idea why those names popped in there, so just ignore those. Those are the names of Richard Cox's sons. So, like many business ventures, the shares were traded and sold among the residents. And by June 1841, the mill was owned by 20 subscribers and was producing a dividend of $2.12 a share. In 1846, the company reorganized with 10 shareholders and each having about 21 shares. And that year, the dividend was $18 per share. By 1850, it peaked to $30 a share. And by 1855, there's a drop off in the profits, with the dividend dropping to $10.50 a share. The first miller from the Cox family, whom we first heard about in Mattituck, then the next miller was John C. Appleby, who started in 1843 for a year, followed by Alfred Smith. And according to the records, the property was taxed at $1.82 by the town. Also, the road to the mill was deemed to be insufficient by one of the customers, who wrote a letter of complaint to the owners saying that the trees and the brush that prevented wagons from passing each other on the pathway to and from the mill, and he was very unhappy that he had to back up or try and force his horses into the brush to get past another person. The ownership of the mill eventually ended up in the hands of Lewis Case, who sold the mill to the Terry family. And Gilbert Terry was remembered by residents as being soft-spoken and was generally covered head to toe in flour dust. In 1870, business was so good that Terry couldn't keep up with demand, and using just the tides, so he decided he was going to put up a large addition on the sound side of the structure, and he installed the windmill that we see here. It was claimed that the mill could grind a bushel in a minute with the added power, or 300 bushels a day. The mill could be used when the wheel was idle or when the water froze. In late November 1898, a very fierce nor'easter swept through the area, pulling all the vanes off of the windmill. Rather than repair the windmill, it was just left standing. Terry kept on using just the tidal power of this particular mill. In the early 1900s, he retired, and the mill passed on to Isaac Horsfall from Yorkshire, England, who was unable to make a living off of the few farmers still doing business with the mill. The farmers were sending their grain off to mechanized mills, and the tidal and wind power mills were being regarded as very old tech at this point. The building was abandoned and became the subject of photos and paintings before being torn down. And today we have one of our local parks there, and some of the stones are at the Historical Society. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Is there anything left there to see?
What's there is you can see the channel and there's a couple of stones there. The rest of the stones and one of the grinding stones are at the Historical Society. The grinding stone is being used as a doorstep, sorry, and the stones that used to line the channel that the Historical Society got, they now use as the bumpers for the cars in the parking lot. Sorry. But yeah, that's people will go there and they'll go into Goldsmith Inlet and they'll go into an inflatable tube and then ride the current out to the Sound now. It goes out and then makes a right turn. Mm-hmm.
Not this one, but one before this. That is still standing.
Mattituck Mill is still standing, yes. It's now a restaurant, still a restaurant, I should say, has just recently been, it was stood empty for a while, it's just recently been reorganized again as a restaurant. Fortunately or unfortunately for us, it's not being very popular as a restaurant. They say that you can wait hours for a waitress to come by, but the food's okay. But it does have... It does, today it has, it's the same one. This is just the dance pavilion off the side of it that you can see here. So yeah, maybe someday you might want to come to Mattituck and to have a meeting there. They do say that during Prohibition, this was one of the many speakeasies that we had, which we call Blind Tigers. And apparently, like the one Claudio's, which is another restaurant in Greenport, the boats would float underneath and they'd pop a hatch up underneath the floorboards and they'd just pass the cases up into the bar directly from the boat straight up into the building. So there you go. Any other?
Yeah, one more. There's a lot more titles.
Well, that's because I went into Riverhead a little bit, which was Southold at one point.
I'm wondering, where did their raw material come from? Did it
Mostly grinding grain, corn.
all the green? Where was it from?
Oh, all up and down the peninsula. Yeah, so Southold is settled in 1640, and by the Revolution, we've pretty much run out of land. It's a peninsula, a long, narrow peninsula. So pretty much all the land has been bought up just before the Revolution. And the sons of the local farmers are actually moving to Orange County, Westchester. They're moving to Pennsylvania because there's no place for them to buy land. So pretty much the entire North Fork at that point in time is being heavily farmed. And what you didn't, if you couldn't get a farm, a lot of times you would farm and fish, or you would just fish and have a little bit of a farm. There was a lot of variations on how you could make your money. So we had lots and lots of grain. And what we would do is we would put whatever it is, you get a better price if your grain or corn is clean and ground into flour than you do if you're just sending the raw material in. We would send our goods to New York City, we would send them to Boston, we'd send them to New London, we'd send them to this area. There were ships that we call coastermen that were the truckers of the time period, and they lasted all the way up until the advent of the automobile, those coastermen. Any other questions? Okay.